Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special Tortoise ThinkIn. I'm Matt Dancona, one of the editors at Tortoise, and it's my distinct honor to welcome the great Carol Ann Duffy, who, if you have the slightest interest in poetry and the world of letters, will be familiar to you already as quite simply one of the finest living poets. Now, the proximate cause of tonight's ThinkIn is to mark the publication of Carol Ann's new anthology, Empty Nest, Poems for Families, which is in fact published today. And I can't recommend it highly enough to you all. It's a very, very extraordinary piece of work. I usually, for a poetic anthology, I read it in one sitting. And it's an emotional powerhouse of a book, which explores the joys and the loss of parenthood and the relationship between children and their parents and the intensity of feeling that is part and parcel of family life. And it's a tremendous collection. As ever, we want to hear your thoughts and ideas and reflections, which I hope will, and I'm sure will be many. And my colleague Mark St. Andrew will be at the helm of the chat this evening. So please do steer your ideas in his direction. Not to waste any further time, let's dive straight in with Carol Ann. First of all, welcome. Thank you very much for doing this. And I think we discussed this just before and thought it might be a nice way of beginning for you to actually read some of the poetry.
Well, thanks, Matt. It's lovely to be here, albeit virtually. And firstly, I'd like to thank everyone at Picador, my publishers, for producing such a beautiful edition of these fantastic poems, and particularly Camilla Elworthy, the publicity director there, who's worked with me for 20 years or more. So Empty Nest is its title, and empty nest syndrome is something we will all have heard about, the experience that parents or guardians go through when children leave home and begin their lives either in work or at college or universities. And when my own 18-year-old left home to go to university, I eventually came to write this poem called Empty Nest. And I think I published it in a collection called Sincerity. And when I was reading the poem at poetry readings, I was struck by how many people came up and wanted that poem, and it mattered to them. And it's not often that happens with poems. People like poems, read them, but a poem that becomes something else is very unusual, certainly in my experience. So it formed the seed of the anthology, and I thought I'd like to go through poems from the past, poems being written now, and see how that subject had been dealt with. And then, of course, the project changed and evolved as I went through it. So I'm going to read 8 poems from the anthology to start us off. And I'll start with my original poem, Empty Nest. Dear child, the house pines when you leave. I research whether there is any bird who grieves over its empty nest. Your vacant room is a still life framed by the unclosed door, read by sunlight, an open book on the floor. I fold the laundry, hang your flower dress in darkness, forget-me-not. Beyond the tall fence, I hear horse chestnuts counting themselves, then autumn, Christmas. You come and go singing, then ice, snowdrops, while home hides its face in hands of silence. I knew mothering, but not this other thing which hefts my heart each day heavier. Now I know. This is the shy sorrow. It will not speak up. I play one chord on the piano. It vanishes, tactful, as dusk muffles the garden, a magpie staring from its branch. the marble girl standing by the bench. From the local church, bells like a spelling, and the evening star like a text. And then what next? You can see the piano in the poem behind me there. And the next poem is by a former Poet Laureate, C.D. Lewis. I think that this is one of his finest poems. And this is about his son leaving home, and the father, the poet in the poem is thinking about that and trying to find some kind of meaning. Walking away. It is 18 years ago, almost to the day, a sunny day with the leaves just turning, the touchlines new ruled, since I watched you play. Your first game of football, then like a satellite wrenched from its orbit, go drifting away behind a scatter of boys. I can see you walking away from me towards the school, with the pathos of a half-fledged thing set free into a wilderness, the gait of one who finds no path where the path should be. That hesitant figure, eddying away like a winged seed loosened from its parent stem, has something I never quite grasped to convey about nature's give and take, the small, the scorching ordeals which fire one's irresolute clay. I've had worse partings, but none that so gnaws at my mind still. Perhaps it is roughly saying what God alone could perfectly show, how selfhood begins with a walking away, and love is proved in the letting go. And the next poem is also by another laureate, the former Scottish national poet Liz Lockhead, who's a great friend of mine. And as I was putting this book together, I realized that it had to be more than parents' points of views. It had to be siblings or other relatives. And the child also had to speak back, because of course we're all, if we're anything, we are all children. So in this poem, Liz is writing about her younger sister. I think her sister was maybe a decade younger than her. So the young sister is 12 in the poem, and Liz would have been about 22 or so. Poem for my sister. My little sister likes to try my shoes, to strut in them, admire her spindle-thin 12-year-old legs in this season's styles. She says they fit her perfectly, but wobbles on their high heels, they're hard to balance. I like to watch my little sister playing hopscotch, admire the neat hops and skips of her, their quick peck, never missing their mark, not overstepping the line. She is competent peever. I try to warn my little sister about unsuitable shoes, point out my own distorted feet, the calluses, odd patches of hard skin. I should not like to see her in my shoes. I wish she could stay sure-footed, sensibly shod. And we mentioned the piano earlier, and here is a poem simply called Piano by the great D.H. Lawrence. And I think this is one of my favorite poems from when I first started reading poetry seriously as a teenager. Piano. Softly, In the dusk, a woman is singing to me, taking me back down the vista of years, till I see a child sitting under the piano in the boom of the tingling strings and pressing the small, poised feet of a mother who smiles as she sings. In spite of myself, the insidious mastery of song betrays me back till the heart of me weeps to belong to the old Sunday evenings at home with winter outside and hymns in the cozy parlor, the tinkling piano our guide. So now it is vain for the singer to burst into clamor with the great black piano appassionato. The glamour of childish days is upon me. My manhood is cast down in the flood of remembrance. I weep like a child for the past. The next poem is by the American poet William Meredith, also another laureate. I must have a thing for laureates. I must curb this tendency. It's written in couplets, so I'll try my very best to read it, but it's kind of funny, but also moving. Parents. What it must be like to be an angel or a squirrel, we can imagine sooner. The last time we go to bed good, they're there, lying about darkness. They dandle us once too often, these friends who become our enemies. Suddenly one day, their juniors are as old as we yearn to be. They get wrinkles where it is better smooth, odd coughs and smells. It is grotesque how they go on loving us. We go on loving them. The effrontery, barely imaginable, of having caused us and of how. Their lives. Surely we can do better than that. This goes on for a long time. Everything they do is wrong. And the worst thing, they all do it, is to die, taking with them the last explanation, how we came out of the wet sea or wherever they got us from, taking the last link of that chain with them. Father, mother, we cry, wrinkling to our uncomprehending children and grandchildren. Last year, the great Irish poet Evan Boland died suddenly and far too early. She has 3 wonderful poems in this anthology, and I think, and I wish I could have told her this, that Evan Boland is probably the greatest recent poet of motherhood. Her poems are just quite extraordinary. And of the 3 here, this is my favorite, The Necessity for Irony. On Sundays, when the rain held off, after lunch or later, I would go with my 12-year-old daughter into town and put down the time at junk sales, antique fairs. There, I would lean over tables, absorbed by lace, wooden frames, glass. My daughter stood at the other end of the room, her flame-colored hair obvious whenever, which was not often, I turned around. She was gone, grown, no longer ready to come with me whenever a dry Sunday held out its promises of small histories, endings. When I was young, I studied styles, their use and origin, which age was known for which ornament, and was always drawn to a lyric speech, a civil tone, but never thought I would have the need, as I do now, for a darker one. Spirit of irony, my caustic author of the past, of memory, and of its pain, which returns, hurts, stings. Reproach me now. Remind me that I was in those rooms with my child, with my back turned to her, searching, oh irony, for beautiful things. Oh, that was hard to read. Ivan. And I'll finish with a lovely poem by Grace Nichols, who will be well known to anyone who does GCSE English. And this comes towards the end of the book, and it's called Praise Song for My Mother. You were water to me, deep and bold and fathoming. You were moon's eye to me, cool and grained and mantling. You were sunrise to me, rise and warm and steaming. You were the fish's red gill to me, the flame tree spread to me, the crab's leg, the fried plantain smell, replenishing. Go to your wise futures, you said. So there's 8 poems of the 99 for you to think about.
Thank you, Carol Ann. That was quite simply sublime and very moving. My questions seem very banal in comparison, but I would like to ask you a few things about the themes that emerge in those wonderful readings, and also some of the other poems. And one of them is just looking, taking the emptiness title of the collection, and indeed your own poem of that title. That the departure of children, when they leave home, but also in the C. Day Lewis poem, where he's just observing a moment of departure, if you like, and he says how selfhood begins with a walking away and love is proved in the letting go. And then in your poem, Empty Nest, you say, I knew mothering, but not this other thing which hefts my heart each day, heavier now I know. And is there an extent to which the part of the process of parenting is to teach people something about the nature of love that they might not have experienced in romantic love, or the love they have for their own parents?
Gosh, that's not banal at all. That's profound. Require a PhD. I think in my poem, the sense I had was that we spend usually 18 years teaching our children how to leave home, preparing them, giving them all the resources that we feel that they will need to go out into the world. And it's a moment of celebration and joy, A-level day or getting a job or whatever initial success your teenager has is a great occasion. And it's what we have aimed for, really. But what I hadn't anticipated was, and I think this is true for many people, was the grief that accompanies that leaving. And I refer to it in the poem as the shy sorrow, right, because it's not often particularly spoken about. and often a very private, perhaps lonely changing of who you are in relation to your child. So those were my issues in that poem. And of course, the attitude to love is the same in mine as in C.D. Lewis's. They're just circling it from a different angle, I think.
Different angle. I mean, I have, as I was saying before we began, I've children who are, you know, at various stages of leaving home to pursue education or are already there. And one of the things that spoke to me, and this is in a way a selfish question, which is that one of the things that you don't expect, even though you're warned of it, is that you are being outgrown, not by any kind of cruelty, but just a sort of sense of that you've somehow completed your engineered task. And one of the poems you collect is Outgrown by Penelope Shuttle. It says, "It's both freedom and a prison to be outgrown by her as she towers over me, as thin as a sequin, in her Doc Martens and her pretty skirt, because just as I work out how to be a mother, she stops being a child." And I thought that was very powerful. And I wonder if we underrate that emotion. I mean, following on what you just said, Carol Ann, you know, about the fact that it is the shy sorrow, that perhaps we don't talk enough about it.
Well, I mean, it's the natural order of things. Talking about it is good, because there will be people, I was one of them, who can be ambushed by the kind of weight of that grief. So talking about things is good. But I mean, I remember when I went to university, I went off to Liverpool University at 18. Couldn't wait. And I remember going off in a taxi and waving goodbye to my mother, who was weeping on the doorstep. And to my lifelong shame, I just felt irritated. I had no comprehension of what she was feeling. I just thought, yeah, whatever. I'm going to uni, you know. So the more, and this is what poetry can do. I mean, I think poetry is the music of being human. The more poetry can step into these silences with good poems, and people can read them, the better, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think seeing my children, my sons, leave the house, as it were, certainly illuminated the moment when I'd left the house. And I remember vividly my father describing an experience when I went on a year traveling around the States, and he happened to be in New York at the same time. So we met up, and then I went off and did my thing, and he, you know, without a second thought really. And he then described many years later the pain he'd felt watching me walk across Times Square. And I didn't understand that until I saw my own leave. And I think that poetry can kind of illuminate that, can't it? It can help to nurture those connections in time.
Yes, I mean, poetry, it's a place where language is used very, very differently from anywhere else. I often think akin to prayer. And I hope this particular anthology will be a place people can go. And maybe if I'd read this when I was 18, I wouldn't have been annoyed at my mum so much when she was crying.
But it is as natural that the child is. I mean, it would be wrong, wouldn't it? There's a I think partly tongue-in-cheek, partly very sad poem by Gabriela Mistral, Let Him Not Grow Up. He has all he needs: laughter, frowns, skills, airs and graces. He doesn't need to grow. Well, that's not literally true, but it does describe, doesn't it, an emotion that every parent feels as they anticipate that moment of departure.
Yes, of course, it's just capturing a moment. I think Tennyson's son once described sonnet as a moment's monument. And there are times, particularly with little babies or toddlers, where you can't bear the thought of them going out into the world as we as adults know it. But these are layers upon layers upon layers upon layers, and what I've tried to do in this book is bring as many layers in as I can, and circle around that nest.
And again, you talk about all sorts of directions of travel, of emotion, and I love the poem "Those Winter Sundays" by Robert Hayden, where he remembers his father's quiet rising early in the morning to ready the fires, with no expectation and indeed no receipt of gratitude. And he writes, what did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? This is a wonderful phrase. And I think there's part of it is a retrospective. It's a kind of looking in the rearview mirror, isn't it? And re-auditing our experience and remembering what we owe, and as well as what we've lost.
Well, that's why when I got deeper into the anthology as editor, I started to bring in the perspective of the child. I mean, the poem you just mentioned is, if you like, an ex-child.
Yeah.
And that's something that we all live with. We all live with perhaps regrets about our parents, or things that we didn't fully understand when we were younger, things that we wish we'd done differently. So, we grow from childhood to adolescence to adulthood to parenthood, if we want to have children, to becoming older. It's like, but you have to kind of walk the journey. It's not possible, I think, to understand parenthood unless you have a child. It's not possible to understand bereavement unless you experience it. But I think poetry can be some kind of guide between the literal experience and the empathy.
No, absolutely. And I think it's important not to leave people on the call with the impression that the book is entirely or indeed principally devoted to sadness and grief, because there's a lot of, I wouldn't call it resolution, but somewhere between catharsis and consolation. There's an image in the Tennyson poem you use about being absorbed, his son and he being absorbed into the sea together, and somehow meeting there, if at least metaphorically. And then there's a wonderful, one of my favorites in the collection, actually, a poem by Maxine Cumin called The Envelope, which says, even know that at the hour of my death, my daughters will absorb me, even knowing they will carry me about forever inside them. And she uses the image of Russian dolls, which is a wonderful way of describing ancestry. And she also uses the metaphor of the chain letter. So there's a lot of joy in this as well, actually, isn't there?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, I hope it's truthful. I hope, I mean, a lot of them are very funny.
Yeah.
Some of them are combative. There is a lot of love and regret as well, but I hope it's as uplifting as the whole family experience itself is, with all its quirks and complexities. But no, it's not a dark book.
No, not at all. I wondered if I might come to my colleague and indeed the co-founder of Tortoise, Katie Vanek Smith, who, Katie, I don't know if you're there. Hi, Katie. You just made a very powerful point in the chat earlier about your son, and I thought it was such a beautiful point that if you were able to share it.
Well, so Carol Ann, obviously my son's only 10, so I haven't experienced the moment in motherhood or parenthood that you were referring to when you talk about the empty nest syndrome. And I thought the sort of toughest parts of motherhood were behind me. And I hadn't really fully appreciated that I might have this grief moment, because I spend my life, I think a little bit like you said, thinking about how I get him ready, and sort of almost in my mind, I'm like, at 18, bye, thanks very much. It's been lovely knowing you. And then you can come and look after me when I'm old. And I just, as you were talking about this, I was thinking, oh my God, I thought all the tough stuff was behind me. And then, so my mum's on this call as well. So I private messaged my mum and said, Mum, did you cry or did you celebrate when I left? So I was like, I thought it was a celebration. I genuinely thought when we left home that our parents would celebrate the fact that they had all this freedom again. So I won't speak for my mum, but I'd sort of had this sort of sudden moment of like, oh, I thought the tough bit was behind, and you've made me now sort of want to run out and buy the anthology so I sort of can prepare myself and put this on my radar. So that was my thought anyway. So I just had no concept. I just thought you were all looking forward to us leaving. As children, I just thought we were all, you know, like brought into the world, and then off you go, darlings. It's nice to have met you, and now go and come back and look after me when I'm older. Sorry.
So funny.
And it should be said that Katie's son Stan is a complete diamond, so I can completely understand why she would feel that way. I wonder if Elizabeth Lewis is there. Elizabeth.
Yes, I am. Hi. Yeah.
Hi, you had a very good question about sort of about preparing for the empty nest, I think.
Yes. Well, because just as I asked the question, Carol Ann sort of answered it, because I was sort of saying, the hope would be to read the poetry as a guide to navigate your way around the emptiness, which, you know, as a mother, my children are 15 and 13, and it's sort of looming, and you know that it's coming, and you read articles about it, and you know but there's nothing you can do, obviously, and you want them to go. You're racking them, making them do their revision all the time so they get their GCSEs, they go to university. That's the plan. But then when the plan's fulfilled, you know you're left, as you know, it's this horrible double-edged sword. But the poetry, if the poetry can salve that, you know, and give you some comfort, that would be the hope, I think, to sort of somehow. You mentioned it was like a prayer. I thought was very interesting. That sounds, or a hymn, you know, something to hold on to in these times, because it is a shy sorrow is that also very apposite, I think, because I mean, mums talk about it with each other. I talk to my sort of girlfriends all the time about, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to be all right? You know, okay, we can go on holiday when, you know, in the school holiday, you know, outside school holidays, but so what? You know, we just want to be with our kids again, you know. So yes, but poetry, I think people do turn to poetry for comfort, and I think you do start reflecting on your own, as you said, about your own parents, and how, you know, my mother, you know, was on her own when I went, and I didn't realise, and now I'm thinking, God, if I could talk to her today, I know how horrendous it must have been and lonely for her. Yeah, it's very moving. It's very moving.
I hope when you read it that you start at the beginning and go to the end.
Yes.
Because I have tried very hard to make it a kind of journey, and I have a kind of call and response going on within it.
Yes.
And some of these poems have been with us forever. I mean, we have some by Shakespeare, as well as people like Tennyson and Edward Thomas, John Clare. And I think in poetry we find ourselves. So I think of this anthology, perhaps more than any of the others I've ever done, is somewhere to go. I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's anything at all wrong with children leaving home. And of course they should, and of course they should go, and we should celebrate, and we do celebrate, but there needs to be a kind of acknowledgement of the sadness, I think.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Carol Ann. And now, just to continue the theme, Katie's mum, Sue Vanek, who's universally known at Tortoise, with Reverend Sonora's Mrs. V, is there. Are you there, Sue? Hi.
Hi, Matt.
Good to see you. Tell us, vaccinated as well and everything.
Yeah.
So tell us what you think. Tell us what you think about all this.
I actually never thought about it, and just hoped that Katie had learnt enough and I'd equipped her with enough skills to cope with whatever life threw at her. And I'm quite sure that I hadn't alienated her, so she could always come back to me and actually discuss with me anything that she didn't cope with. And she had a brother, and then I could actually look after him. She'd had 4 years of not having anybody about, and he'd always had her about, big sister. And now it was his time to have a bit of me time, totally. So I didn't celebrate. I probably celebrated when John left home, which was literally only 5 years ago at 38. And I was thinking, people said, what will you do? And I went, I think I might go down the pub and celebrate. Because it's hard work, but equally it's rewarding work, I think. But I never thought about it at the time, and I never thought about it when John left. I was just thinking, right, thank God for that. And that was it.
And there's a wonderful thing, and I certainly experienced this of then becoming, if not quite peers, then kind of friends with your parents again in a totally different way from the original relationship you had when you were growing up.
Yes, I think so. I think that I would class Katie as a friend. I don't think I've probably only had one instant, I think, since her leaving home that I've had to sort of say to her, and I think come outside and I need to speak to you away from everybody else, and actually remind her that I am actually her mother and I don't expect to be spoken to like that. Or it's about respect, I think. And I think that when you become friends with your children, they can actually sometimes tread on that respect. I will immediately push back the boundary and say, because I was always brought up to respect my elders. And I think it's a very, very important thing. I think respect is something we earn. I think we all have to strive for that. But I didn't feel sadness when she went. I was really proud of her. Yeah. I think, people used to say, are you proud of Katie? And I would say, well, if Katie is my pride, John is my joy. He makes me laugh. I don't have to continually correct, and he makes me laugh, full stop. And I think boys are completely different to girls. Girls are...
So you're now making me look back and hope that I was appropriately respectful to my parents. But thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Carol Ann, I just wanted to come back to you on that point, because it does raise an interesting question about the emptiness and indeed the art that it generates and will generate as we live longer, we perhaps live with our parents, you know, into later. Will there be a kind of, will almost be a return to the nest? Will there be creativity that emerges from that?
I don't understand the question.
Well, in the sense that the standard operation at the moment is you leave home, but now actually parents live longer. A lot of people don't have the option necessarily to move into a home of their own immediately, and so
Actually, yeah.
In many cases, there's a sort of reunion of parent and child when both are adults and fully formed.
Yeah, I was reading something about this last month that I think because so many young adults can't afford to get their own home, that they're having to go back and live with their parents. I mean, it would be very easy to find the statistics on that, but I think it is increasing. And given what we've just gone through and what we're about to go through economically, I think that probably will increase. But my view would be that although the empty nest experience is painful, that it's essential and to be wished for, and to not be able to, you know, fly is not a good thing. So
that's very interesting.
I think it will be troubling if that became a thing. And then there's the other end of it, where you're talking about people living longer. Is I mean, I have friends whose parents have had to sell their homes in order to pay for their care. So family homes are, and will increasingly, I think, have to be sold if parents need to go into care homes. So it's a mess, really. But perhaps out of the scope of this anthology, there's questions which I think are essentially political, really.
Yes, and artists tend to in the end help us to bring sense to mess, I guess. I'd love to come to Anne Spackman, who's a great friend of Tortoise and very distinguished journalist. Annie, are you there? Hi, Anne. How are you? Oh, yeah, I think you're still on mute.
It didn't click properly.
Oh, there you go. Yes. No, you had a very interesting point to make about the sort of going back to Carol Ann's point about shy sorrow and the guilt and shame around that.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of a kind of arc of success, and that narrative has people whose children have grown up, then living their own very full lives. And my children are 31 and 29, they're adults and not children at all in that sense. And I remember when they left home, hearing friends talking quietly in little ways, probing about whether or not they were allowed to admit that actually there was a real sense of loss. And that the loss seems in a way not logical when you spent so much of your time worrying about them not coming home and are they doing drugs and will they get stabbed in the park and all the kind of stuff that goes on through late teenage years. But actually being allowed and being given permission to say, but I'm very sad. I'm deeply sad. I feel that shy sorrow, that is such a wonderful phrase. And I think that I got this today, the book, and so I've been sort of getting through it as fast as I can. But I think it allows people, it gives people that sense that this is okay. It's a real feeling, and we're allowed to feel those things. And it doesn't matter if they conflict with this narrative of success, that we're all out there kind of living incredible lives. We actually have an internal life which isn't quite like that.
Carol Ann, do you, it's an interesting question, all of this, which is, do you as a poet feel that you have a social function, in the sense that it's part of your task when you sit down and write these lines, these incredible lines, to help people with these difficulties and or is that a sort of happy byproduct that you know your readers may find it easier to deal with the shy sorrow? In other words, are you trying to help people, or is that no part of the artist's initial intention?
Oh, well, there's many answers to that. I think as a poet, I mean, I started writing quite young, sort of fell in love with poetry, you know, as a child, really, and wrote from then on. And when I first started writing, I felt that I was unique as a person, that I was a unique individual in the world, and that everyone else was, so that we were all separately unique. So if I wrote a poem, it was unique to me. And through my journey as a poet, it wasn't until I was, you know, middle-aged really, that I had a revelation that in fact we're all the same. And that kind of informed my poetry in a very important way to me, so that when I write with a notebook, longhand, rewrite. Of course, I'm just writing for myself, for the language, for the empty page. But in the background, I have a sense that I'm the same as everyone else, and it is the music of being human. So I never feel that anything I might write might be unusual. I feel certain that it's common to all of us.
And that is a poetic function. Yes, I mean when you talk about the music of being human, the novel has its function, music has its function, but I'm sensing that for you, poetry, which has proved an extraordinarily resilient form in spite of many claims that it was on the verge of death and disappearing and everything, has that very specific purpose and capacity.
Yes, I mean, Samuel Beckett, I think, first said all poetry is prayer. I can't really better that.
Yeah, no, it's a.
But it doesn't have to tell a story.
No.
I mean, you were talking earlier about one of the poems in the anthology. It can capture an instant forever. So in that sense, poetry outwits time, as Shakespeare demonstrates, forever. Nothing can take away the moment captured by a good poem. And also, poetry only ever seeks to add to the world. A marvelous poem is putting something new into the world that wasn't there before. So poetry is generous and giving. It's like the language equivalent of a garden. It's adding and renewing always. So it's a very special way of using words.
Thank you, Carol Ann. I wanted to come to Hattie Brewis, if Hattie's there.
Yes,
Hi,
I am.
how are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thanks. How are you, Matt?
Good. You had a point, I think.
Oh, I did. Yes, sorry, I put it in the chat. I was just thinking about kind of whether Carol Ann had explored how maybe the nature of parenthood has sort of evolved over the years. And by that, I mean more kind of whether the pain of separation is perhaps greater among parents kind of nowadays than, let's say, of 100 years ago, because relationships between parents and children have become closer on the whole. I'm thinking of my dad's relationship with his parents, and it was a lot more formal. They certainly didn't talk about all the things that I talk about my parents and talk about with my parents. And so I've just wondered if there has been, if you know, being a parent means very different things to what it used to.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as we've become more childish, sort of the baby boomer generation, I suppose. So adults now have toys and they like chill time and they're into their music and all that sort of thing. Whereas in the past it was teenagers and young people who did that. You didn't have your parents playing video games or music in that sense. So there is an argument for perhaps saying that the gap between the parent and the child has closed, but that might be to do with kind of consumerism and getting stuff. I was very close to my mum, and not in any way that I can see that's different from how close I am to my own daughter. I would tell my mum anything, and she was good, and we did things together. But she was, you know, we were from a big sort of Irish Catholic family, so it was that. I had friends whose parents were more formal, and there was a distance there, or perhaps you might have gone to boarding school, so your relationship with your parents is different again. So I think it depends on the culture. But no, I haven't researched it. That's just sort of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I was actually going to also talk about the differences, the kind of cultural differences that you touched on. So I lived in South America for a while, and the relationship between parents and children there is also very different because it is an ostensibly Catholic country, and so kids will live with their parents well into their 20s until they get married, essentially. And so it's a very, and then even so I lived with a Chilean family, and so the kids would speak to their parents every single day, even after they got married, and they would meet every single weekend. So there wasn't that same, I mean, I don't imagine there was that same sense of flying the coop, or maybe the parents didn't have that same sense of kind of empty nest syndrome, because they maintained this constant contact all the time. So I'd just be interested to know, you know, again, how that experience differs across different cultures as well.
It would make a really good academic book for someone. Maybe not poetry book.
Yeah, maybe.
Carol Ann, I just wanted to exploit my position as host and do a slight left turn, because one of the things that strikes me in reading the chat, I think it's very clear, is that this has been a very emotionally draining period for everyone, and a lot of things that people want to say have gone on said simply because the business of putting left foot in front of right every morning is so important. And I know that you have been involved in a project called Right Where We Are Now at Manchester Metropolitan, which has generated an amazing archive of sort of recollections, of poetic recollections of people and where they were and where they are at certain times in the pandemic. And I wondered if you might reflect on that a little.
Yes, of course. Well, again, it's part of my interest in the anthology as a form, but Right Where We Are Now, which is permanently online at Manchester Metropolitan University, you can just Google it, is more of a kind of radical reinvention of the anthology. So I asked poets to write in real time and date and place you know, when they wrote the poem. So we started, I think, in February with some very early poems from China, and then I closed it on the 30th of June, by which time we had upwards of 500 or more poems. So it's an extraordinary poetic document. Some wonderful poems. We have people like Jackie Kay and Don Patterson, Billy Collins, poets from different countries, and you just get a sense of how people were living through the first shocking months of the pandemic, and where they were and what they were doing, and all these voices coming together.
And I think it's very interesting. And again, it's easy to push too much burden onto the shoulders of the poet. But there's a wonderful phrase by Sol Bellow about what happens in times of adversity and emergency, that people resort to what he calls crisis chatter. And I wonder whether at that sort of time, the sort of time we've been through and are still going through, poetry can be the counterbalance to crisis chatter, that whether consciously or otherwise, it performs that function in enabling us to find meaning in what may often appear meaningless.
Well, I think everything we've been saying in the past hour would agree with you. I mean, the thing about a poem, and I'm talking here about written poems rather than Instagram or Twitter poetry, but written poems, even if you're writing in real time, say the 1st of May 2020, Much Wenlock, you have to spend all day crafting that poem, and you have to think about the shape of the poem and the language you're using and how that little net of language can best hold what you want to say. So it's careful, and by that I mean it's full of care, and a lot of other ways we use language is careless.
No, that's very true. Tragically, we're coming to the end of our hour with you, Carol Ann, and I think I'm pretty sure I speak on behalf of everyone that it's been a real privilege hearing you. It's not every day you get to hear a Carol Ann Duffy poetry reading, and it's certainly not every day you get to hear so many interesting points of view, your own and the responses of people to your wonderful observations. And you've brought an emotion and intensity and a pause for reflection that I think has been tremendous for all of us. So we wish you every possible good fortune with the book, which is wonderful. Urge everyone to on the call, if you haven't already, to buy it, get hold of it, read it, enjoy it. We'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock with SenseMaker Live on the question of whether or not we should push everyone back to repeat a year at school, which is a very interesting and important question. For now, thank you, Carol Ann, and thank you to everyone else, and have a great evening.